Hey team, welcome back to the show. Today I'm joined once again by my man, Brandon DaCruz, for part two of the Rapid Fat Loss series. Dude, thank you for being back.
Absolutely, my friend. I knew that last week's podcast was not going to be a one-parter, so I look forward to
No
imparting
chance.
more value and applicable advice in this week's episode. And I'm really happy that we can do an expansive take on this topic because it is something that is nuanced. There's a lot of context to be considered, and I think that we are great at doing series. So let's keep this going.
All right, let's get into it so we don't turn this into like a three or four parter. But where we left off, we were discussing the diet structure. We discussed target rate of loss. And in general, we determined we probably want to aim for about 1.25 to 1.5% of body weight loss per week. So from there, that really determines our caloric needs and how large of a deficit we want to create, right? We're basing the deficit around the target rate of loss. Roughly, if we want to lose a pound of fat per week, we want to be in about a 3,500 calorie deficit, more or less, right? And we're building around that. Anything else you want to add on determining calorie needs before we get into determining an individual's protein needs here?
Absolutely. So one thing I would advise, I'm not giving a specific calorie intake range or a specific target to hit. And this is something that this has not only been in practice that I've seen this to be most advantageous because of the fact that we need to individualize it towards the person, their starting body fat percentage, the degree of a deficit that they can actually hit and sustain throughout the course of this rapid fat loss phase, but also through more off-air chats that I've had with Lyle, where his initial book did give calorie ranges, and now he has updated his thoughts on that and realized that it really needs to be back calculated, or it really needs to be protein centric. Like start with your protein intake and then build from there, rather than the arbitrary calorie values. So if someone is interested in this, you have to realize that it needs to be individualized on your body composition, meaning your starting body fat level, your lean mass level, the protein intake needs that you'll need, which we'll discuss next. And then also you have to look at your history. How large of a deficit have you been able to induce and sustain? Because it's not enough to just say, hey, listen, I can put myself in a 1,500 calorie deficit, for 1 or 2 days, and then I rebound back out and I actually eat more than is my maintenance. It really needs to be something that you can sustain and realize this is not a sustainable approach. This is a difficult approach. So I'm never going to discount that. But you need to be able to sustain it at least for, in my case, 1 to 2 weeks, or in many of the cases that I work with clientele, I'm doing it 1 to 3 days a week. But it needs to still be a level at which that person can actually get through the day and then get into the next. And that's why I really like to use the undulating approach, where I utilize rapid fat loss days rather than rapid fat loss phases, because I can literally interject those, say on a Monday, Thursday, Saturday, and then we have higher calorie intake days in between those that give a reprieve from the very low calorie setting that they are in during those rapid fat loss days.
Okay, spot on. And I wanted to get to that structure a little bit more in a moment, but sounds like protein needs we're almost going to determine before we determine calorie needs then, correct?
Yes. So when it comes to RFL, or whether it be rapid fat loss phases or a rapid fat loss day, the most important component from a dietary perspective is going to be setting protein. And I'm setting that total based on an individual's body composition, which is absolutely crucial during an aggressive deficit. So I'm scaling protein intake based on someone's lean body mass and their fat mass. Now, here's the thing. That may not be known. So you may not be able to get someone in a DEXA or a really high level body composition estimation device beforehand. But as an experienced coach, someone like you or myself, Jeremiah, we can make an informed estimate on the body fat percentage, because we do know, someone who has 30% body fat doesn't need the same grams per pound of protein as someone who's already lean and trying to get leaner. So I do this based on their body composition. So for leaner individuals, which would be a male that's under 15% body fat, or a woman that's under 25% body fat, I'll usually set protein around 1.5 grams per pound of body weight per day. Because the leaner someone is, the higher of a protein intake I want to use to be able to protect their lean mass, as they have less fat to essentially tap into as an endogenous fuel source. And so we need more protein to essentially buffer against the large deficit that we're using. Then if we get to individuals in a moderate range of body fat, which would be between 15 to 25% for men and then 25 to 35% for women, I'm generally going to aim for 1.25 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Now, if we have someone in a higher body fat percentage category, which is going to be clearly defined as like 25% plus for males or 35% and above for females, I'm often going to target 1 gram per pound of protein per pound of body weight, which still provides the satiety effects. But considering the fact that these individuals are usually at a much higher body fat percentage than the leaner individuals that we're working with, we don't want to overshoot their needs. with using a higher protein intake. So say, for instance, we have someone that is 30% body fat, a male at 30% body fat and 300 pounds. If we were to go to 1.5 grams per pound of body weight, he's now at 450 grams of protein per day, which is going to put his dietary intake much higher. Whereas in this case, with someone with 30% body fat, meaning he has 90 pounds of stored endogenous fuel on his body in the form of adipose tissue, we can actually use a more moderate protein intake because that extra body fat is going to be muscle sparing in and of itself. And so when it comes down to it, we really want to scale protein based on the body composition of the person itself. And we want to prioritize protein first in the diet because it's not only the most important macronutrient for muscle retention, especially when like energy intake is low and recovery demands are high, but it's also the most satiating macronutrient, which is going to make a massive difference in adherence when dieting aggressively because you are going to be at a lower calorie intake than you're used to. And then we also have the highest thermic effect, which we get from protein, which is just going to increase the energy outside the energy balance equation. So we're already monitoring energy in, but we're also trying to leverage energy out. So in totality, that's why we always start with protein first. And this should really be the approach or the principle that we use with all diets, but it's even more important in the context of, creating a rapid fat loss plan.
Absolutely. So very important for muscle retention. We're getting a good amount, even for those higher body fat individuals, whereas quote unquote lower, we're still getting around a gram per pound of body weight. So okay, quite a good amount of protein still. I am always amazed at in this day and age how many people like start coaching and they're still under eating protein, especially like more advanced individuals or coaches who like know like what they're doing fairly well and will be like, man, we're like 140 pounds and you're only eating 70, 80 grams of protein per day. Like you mentioned the satiety effects of protein. Of course, muscle retention, if we're losing muscle in our fat loss phase, like we're going to have a much harder time in the future alongside getting the body composition we want. It just always blows my mind how many people are under eating protein. It's interesting.
No, absolutely. It's something we both see on intakes every single day. So it is something that needs to be prioritized and needs to be discussed more.
Cool. So then when we're looking at our carb and fat intake, how are we determining our needs here? Is it just keep this as low as possible or what are we looking at here?
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because a lot of people are going to contextualize this as do we go with carbs or do we go with fat? And I get why that question is asked because that is how we would do it if we were discussing a regular fat loss phase. If you and I were on this podcast and we were just talking regular fat loss, we would go, energy balance first, so calorie intake and the size of the deficit. We would go protein next, and then we would, start discussing fuel substrates and those being carbs and fats. However, the diet setup for RFL, or whether it be a phase or an RFL day, is constructed differently because rapid fat loss uses a protein sparing modified fast. And this is a dietary approach which is focused on the goal of creating a large energy deficit to maximize fat loss while using a protein anchored approach to retain muscle. So it does center all around protein like we just discussed, but then in addition to protein, we include vegetables to get in sufficient micronutrients, especially vitamins and minerals, and then also fiber. And then the next focus or primary priority is hitting your essential fatty acid requirements. Now, what I do want to do is a lot of times people, when they hear protein sparing modified fast, which really is what RFL is based around, they have one of two things. They're either thinking this is, a diet, like you said, all right, we're going to do protein, then we're going to look at carbs and fats, or they're like, hey, there's some type of fasting intervention in here. And really, when we discuss a protein sparing modified fast, it does not mean you're fasting in any perspective. It's a modified fast in the sense that it isn't a complete fast in terms of avoiding nutrients. You're still ingesting nutrients throughout the course of the day, but you're making very large reductions from your direct carb and fat sources, such as your starchy carbs, your grains, your nuts, your oils, and basically anything that's high calorie or hyper palatable. So your processed foods, we're eliminating that because we do not have room for that within an aggressive deficit. So in an RFL phase or a day, I construct this around using whole food lean protein sources to keep clients satiated and to ensure that they're getting nutrient dense protein sources as compared to, and I want to allude to this because a lot of times in previous RFL types of programs, they used to utilize a lot of liquid meal replacements. And that it falls apart for two reasons. First and foremost, it doesn't teach you how to actually transition out of the diet because you're not reinforcing behaviors and habits around eating that you can, really what we try to do with the RFL diet is create a skeleton diet that we can add to once, add other foods to and other portions to once we transition out of the diet. But when you utilize a meal replacement, whether that be a program that you send away for, or you're just using shakes and liquid replacements, it doesn't allow you to really construct the habits and behaviors necessary to be able to transition out of that and be set up for success. Now, in addition to the whole food lean protein sources, I add in essential fats from fish oil or omega-3 supplementation to ensure that clients are hitting their essential fatty acid requirements. I use a much higher amount of non-starchy vegetables. This is something Lyle and I have went back and forth about, and I do understand, and this is actually something that I had brought up to him through email, was he used to have this thing where it was like almost unlimited veggies, and then we saw that get taken out of hand. He recommends, I believe, about a cup or 4 cups per day of vegetables. I will do the vegetable intake based on the person's body weight, their satiety levels, their dieting history, and how well we can manage their hunger. So I tend to use a much larger variety in certain cases of non-starchy vegetables, because not only do I want to make sure that person's satiated, but I want to make sure that they're getting the micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals, and the fiber intake needed. Because one thing with aggressive deficits that we need to acknowledge is that, especially for women, there can be a lot of issues with bowel motility. And one issue or one predisposing cause of that are low fiber intake. So we want to make sure that they're replete in fiber, even if we need to add in a fiber supplement to make sure that they're at a sufficient fiber intake to ensure that bowel movements are normalized. And that is something you have to go back and forth with the clientele and look at their biofeedback and look at their intakes or their check-ins to really be able to delineate. And then besides that, so we're looking at sufficient amounts of, obviously high amounts of whole food protein sources. We're looking at essential fatty acids, whether that be through fish oil or omega-3 supplementation. So we get EPA and DHA. We're getting micronutrient-rich vegetables. And then from there, we also want to make sure that we get sufficient electrolytes so that they feel better throughout the course of the day. So really, when it comes down to it, the whole construction is, we're getting essential amino acids from your whole food protein sources. You're getting essential fatty acids from your fish oil or omega-3 supplementation, and then vitamins and minerals from micronutrient-dense vegetable sources. And we're backfilling the electrolyte needs, because we have to realize that during very low carbohydrate diets, there's essentially an increase in diuresis, and we often lose electrolytes. So that's why people feel very poor, especially initially, during low carbohydrate diets, low calorie diets, and especially during ketogenic diets, where a lot of people will reference that as ketogenic flu. And that's often due to a massive loss of electrolytes, including sodium and potassium. So those are things we need to backfill and really ensure that we've checked all the boxes in terms of someone's nutritional needs, so that we're able to create a large deficit, which can help with them in terms of like losing the amount of fat that we're looking to burn on those rapid fat loss days, but so that everything else from a health perspective is at least checked.
Okay. Okay. Very interesting. So it sounds like from a foods perspective, it's largely just straight up protein and veggies that we're doing here. And then again, we have our essential fatty acids coming from fish oil supplements or things of the sort. Our electrolytes are very important. I know that like when we're looking at like sodium, potassium, like I believe in our work together and again, this isn't a prescription for anyone, but I know we use like no salt, if I'm correct, to get more potassium in, right? Like that's a tool.
Yeah. So just for the explanation, because a lot of people don't, I put that on programs sometimes and people are like, does this mean I'm not taking salt? You have a recommendation. It says 1/4 teaspoon of no salt. And really what
just an empty teaspoon.
Yeah, that's it. It's either no salt or new salt. And all that is that's actually a named product of a potassium salt, which means that they've reshifted the ratios. Instead of getting a high amount of sodium and chloride, you're getting a high amount of potassium and a lower amount of sodium. So oftentimes, if you were to look at the label of something like a new salt or no salt, or even you could look up on Amazon potassium salt substitute, you're going to see between 400 to 600 plus milligrams of potassium in those formulas, whereas usually 1/4 teaspoon of regular sea salts or Redmond real salt, something like that, is going to be 500 to 600 milligrams of sodium. So yes, we still want to get adequate sodium, but a lot of times people are deficient. If you actually look, as of the last time we went through this literature, 98% of Americans were not meeting the potassium intake needs. And that's why I backfill with those type of supplements, but I especially do so during a rapid fat loss phase. So Jeremiah, you're 100% on point. I've used that with you in your program. I use that with a lot of clients, but I utilize more servings of a potassium substitute or potassium, not potassium sparing, but potassium including vegetables in their diet.
Okay. Okay. Because I mean, we'd normally have like what our potatoes or Greek yogurt, I believe, is a pretty good source of potassium. From a protein sources perspective, are you typically biasing more like, and again, none of this is a prescription for anyone, but are you typically biasing more like, hey, I want to like protein sources, just like primarily like a chicken breast, a Greek yogurt? Are there any specific sources you like for satiety more than others there? Of course, we're wanting to bias lower fat options, but I'm curious.
Yeah, we're definitely going with lean protein just to be able to minimize calories and maximize the actual satiety effect. But I like things that have a harder texture. So I'm going to go with something like a chicken breast over like, and this is more from a preparation perspective. If you actually
Yeah.
look at the research on texture, harder textured foods are able to not only do they take longer to chew, which means they extend the time course of that meal, which increases satiety hormones and your ability to actually get satiated in a meal, but they also that tougher texture actually leads to having a greater satiating effect. So I like chicken breasts rather than like crock pot chicken, like strip chicken. We will use sometimes like turkey breast just for the leanness of that. I do like using lean fish with a lot of people if they are someone that will eat seafood. And the reason for that is that if you actually look at the satiety index, besides like steak, fish actually had the highest satiety rating from a protein source. Other things that I like to utilize, especially for someone that is on very minimal calories, are egg whites because they're going to be incredibly useful for the volume amount that we can get from utilizing or cooking eggs, and then they also have a great satiety effect. And then this is something that not only I have changed my mind on, but Lyle and I have really discussed, and this is something he's changed his mind on. If someone has very high protein intake needs, so say for instance, it's a very lean individual that's over 200 pounds, and now they're at the point that they're eating 1.5 grams per pound of body weight, and they're well over 300 grams per day. If that's a struggle for them, we can utilize stuff like protein powders as an adjunctive or a supplementary form of protein just added on top of meals. So that might look like a chicken breast with 1 scoop of whey protein in a shake, but we don't want the foundation or the predominance of someone's protein intake to come from a liquid or powder source. We want it from a whole food source in and of itself.
Yeah. And your whey protein is just not going to be a very satiating food. If nothing else, right?
Absolutely.
It's going to digest so quickly. Whereas in this instance, satiety being so important. Do you think, like, is this typically a situation where, hey, I might prefer someone supplement with a multivitamin as well or something that sort of has an insurance policy to make sure we're taking those boxes, or can we still tick those boxes just through foods?
Honestly, man, I don't think you're going to go wrong with a micronutrient rich multivitamin and multi-mineral. Another thing that I really like to backfill from a supplementation perspective are things like magnesium. For certain individuals, I'm going to backfill selenium. I'm going to make sure that they have an iodine source, so that's going to be through usually iodized table salt. So I'm going to be making sure that they have a very micronutrient complete diet. And also, we have to take into consideration where is that person coming from and what is their background? Have they ever had any type of hormonal issues, even if they are in a hormonally optimized status now? Or are they someone that struggles with getting in enough vegetables? And we know that from our interactions together. Or are they someone that lives a very busy lifestyle and it would be easier rather than doing, say, 2 servings of vegetables, of 2 different vegetables, to be able to really get enough variety and micronutrient density into their diet? They're someone that would rather the convenience of a supplement like a vitamin or multi-mineral, or even in the case like I mentioned previously, for some women I will utilize a fiber supplement. That's not something that's in the RFL plan, but it's something that in that specific individual's case it's advantageous to add in, and it's not breaking the bank from a calorie intake perspective.
Okay. Okay. Spot on. Anything else from a food supplementation perspective you want to mention before we move on?
Yes, I think it's very important to hit on the types of vegetables that we're going to utilize. We really want to utilize non-starchy vegetables for their volume, their fiber content, and then the diversity. Really, what I like to do is to get a nice variety of things, but I utilize very specific vegetables because the unfortunate part of this is that you can break the bank from a calorie perspective utilizing certain vegetables. So if we were to utilize all carrots, or we're going to do beetroots or some type of root vegetable, that could really increase your calorie intake and kind of slow the fat loss. And I've seen that mistake be made by many individuals that are just taking any vegetable works type of perspective. So really when it comes down to it, I do a lot of greens. So that could be your spinach, your kale. I really like romaine lettuce for like a big ass salad. And I'm going to put my sweet honey
Oh
mustard
yeah.
dressing on there. So it's going to be yellow
Got to.
mustard with 0 calorie, like the liquid Splenda. Then from there, I utilize meals with like cucumbers, zucchini, asparagus, green beans, cauliflower, cabbage, if someone can digestively handle that. And then I like to utilize things like bell peppers, mushrooms, radishes, and celery. These are all going to be high in water content. They're going to be low in calories, and they're rich in a lot of the nutrients that we need, specifically magnesium, potassium, folate. They're going to have vitamin K. And so they're not only going to support you from a satiety perspective, but they're also going to help with metabolic, hormonal, and cellular health. So that's one component that I really do try to touch on. And I have conversations with clients. I'm often very specific in my meal plans because I don't want there to be a bottleneck in their rate of progress. Remember, this is a short phase, or this may just be, whether it be 1 to 2 weeks or 1 to 3 days per week. I want to maximize the efficiency of this, because in their mind, they're already going into a low calorie diet, but there's many ways, and we both know this as coaches, that people will either mistrack or they will utilize food sources that aren't as advantageous. So they feel like they're mentally restricted, and they're really putting their all into it, but little mishaps and mistakes are actually slowing down their rate of progress.
Okay. So it really does sound like it's just kind of the skeleton of a solid diet we want to build for anyone to support like a healthy, responsive body. Outside of like, hey, we would of course typically add in a lot more berries, for example, likely, or like potato, orange, things of that nature.
Yes.
Okay, very interesting. Now, when we're talking about this like rapid fat loss days versus just an entire phase of rapid fat loss, and I know you mentioned several times we're going to do likely 1 to 3 rapid fat loss days interspersed within the week. Can you talk through a little bit more what that structure looks like? We discussed this a bit in the first episode, but I want to dig deeper, both like how we decide where those lower calorie days are, and then how many of them there are. And then finally, and I will bring this back, what our intake is like the rest of the week.
Yes. All right. So I want to delineate the two. So a traditional RFL approach, which means you would be doing a rapid fat loss days, involves eating the same low calories every single day. And this is something I've done myself, and I've been successful doing it. And then I've also done it with certain clientele over the years for 1 to 2 week stints at a time, essentially. But in practice, and I have to say this both personally and then also from biofeedback and conversation with clients that have taken through this process, it leads to a massive increase in hunger. You have poor biofeedback, and a lot of times this was not the case for me. I will grin and bear through anything, and it's not due to discipline or willpower or whatever it may be. If I have a very specific goal, so I'll give you a very specific case example. I had a photo shoot many years ago where I booked a job with Men's Fitness magazine, which at that time was one of the biggest fitness magazines out there. And so my agent, gives me the call and says, you have 12 weeks to get through this. And so I'm planning a traditional and moderate fat loss phase. Well, every 2 weeks I had to send in a check-in, essentially, so that they knew I was on track for the exact date that I was doing this photo shoot. Now, at the 8 week part, so I was 8 week point, I was 4 weeks into this. I do my check-in and I get a call from the casting agent, and they say, listen, is there any way you could be ready in 2 weeks? Which means instead of having a full 12 weeks, I would have had 6 weeks. And they explained to me that the two guys that were in front of me for the jobs, this was a video shoot and a photo shoot for Men's Fitness magazine, they were not going to be ready in time. And they said, listen, based on your photos, you're ahead of them. You're more ahead than they are. But we need to take up this. They had already rented out a studio as well as a gym, a private facility in New York City. And so they needed to use that time. And so I had to accelerate. But here was the proposition. They basically told me that instead of getting one type of video shoot, so doing one workout and one photo shoot, I would get to do 3. So I was tripling. Not only did that help me from an exposure perspective, honestly, it was immense exposure for me at that time. Not only did I get to do that video shoot, a photo shoot, I also had the opportunity to actually write the workouts. And at that time, they were doing a lot of ghostwriting. So the athlete or the model was not doing the writing, but because I had a background in not only training people on the floor, I was coaching people online at that time, but I also had a profession that was in the fitness industry. They allowed me the opportunity to write my own workouts, perform them, explain them, and it was just a huge part of exposure. So I told myself, you have 2 weeks to do this. I went right into a rapid fat loss phase, but I had a very time-specific goal. I had a lot of experience with dieting. I had done many contest preps before that, and I had an internal drive and a why, and this is part of my identity. So I always say I never miss. So I stuck to the diet, but I will tell you it was grueling. And doing those, I did 3 back-to-back video shoots in a weekend, so over 2 days. And I went in depleted because I wasn't carb loading for this or anything. I was trying to go in as lean as possible, and it was pretty grueling. So just what I've seen in myself and then also in practice, a lot of times with clientele, what ends up happening is they will get in 7 or 10 days and adherence starts to go awry. So what I have found to be a more beneficial approach, more advantageous for my own clients, is to use essentially a nonlinear approach. I often refer to this as an undulating calorie cycle, where I'm going to strategically cycle their intake across weeks. So rather than running an aggressive deficit every single day, I will often implement targeted rapid fat loss days at a frequency of 1 to 3 times per week, where I place those on non-training days. So on resistant training days, I'm going to bring their calories back up to either maintenance or to a more moderate deficit. And oftentimes, if we're utilizing this across the course of the fat loss phase, I'm going to bring them to a much more moderate, so a small deficit. And in that construction of those resistant training days, that those training days are going to include more carbs and fats in the diet. So they're going to have better performance and recovery, better muscle retention, better hormonal health, and then also much better training quality, which in and of itself is going to preserve muscle mass and metabolic rate. Now, with the client population I work with, I found this to work better than a very low calorie linear diet, meaning every single day of the week, because it supports better adherence since clients know that they'll be eating more on training days. It allows us to prioritize training performance and recovery by fueling when it matters most, and it helps preserve NEAT and maintain better biofeedback across the week. So in my own coaching experience, I found the rapid fat loss days to be more advantageous and more applicable to the client population that I'm working with as compared to, I know I've spoken with other professionals that use rapid fat loss phases. They're working with often a more sedentary and a population that has higher adiposity levels. So they're really looking to get as much buy-in as possible, drive a very large deficit. These aren't people that are really concerned with their training performance or their exercise. They're more so really trying to use diet as one of the, I don't want to say the sole vector for progress, but they're using it as the primary hammer to get fat loss off. And then maybe as they get out of that diet and they transition out, then they get more into exercising. They really prioritize training. But with the population I work with, they're trying to maximize body composition and fat loss. So I really have to take more of a nuanced approach, a more specific approach for those individuals. And that's where I've utilized the rapid fat loss day within the course of the week perspective. And I utilize those on non-training days.
Okay, I like that a lot. And that's, I mean, I learned this from you when we worked together as well, the like training day, rest day approach. Given not to that degree, we never ran a rapid fat loss approach, but I very much, I mean, man, for most people, that's still like my preferred approach. Again, it might not be to that degree, but especially if somebody's getting to the point where they have to dig a fair bit harder. Again, we're not doing like protein veggie days necessarily, but even if I had to dig quite a bit harder, having those couple days a week on rest days where we're digging deeper, getting a lot more of the deficit done, having higher food on training days, people just get on so much better.
100%. And I also just a caveat for this. This is also an approach I found to be advantageous, even in those where they may come from more. I know that the vernacular isn't correct, but we call them endomorphs. You know, we know those body types aren't really correct scientifically. But if we were to say someone that's an endomorph, they're more predisposed towards precipitously gaining body fat. I've actually found it advantageous to keep like one RFL day or one very low calorie day in their diet, just so they practice the skill of dieting and really maintaining a deficit, but also it keeps them leaner long term. So for certain individuals, this is something, yes, I utilize during a fat loss phase, but sometimes as I transition them out of the diet, I may keep one of those days in check so that we can offset some of the, I don't want to say the calorie excess that they're getting into, because that's not my intention, but it's something that keeps their body composition in a better place long term.
It's really interesting. I've actually started to do that a lot in the last year as well. Again, not necessarily like a protein sparing modified fast day, but we might have like 2 days a week that are quite a lot lower. And like even for like a more gym pop, like our like gym pop athlete type person who we work with a lot, again, who wants a little bit more flexibility as well. Like, man, we could also have those other 5 days a week a lot higher. And I find that people really don't mind having 1 to 2 days a week that are quite low, especially if they have a couple days a week where we're very busy. Interesting. Okay. So when we're talking cardio and movement, now, this is, of course, quite different than the high energy flux, eat more, move more approach. Move more, eat more. It's the correct order, correct?
Yeah, so I always do it. Eat more, move more. We want to put energy in the system, then we pull it out.
So we are eating a lot less. So is this a phase where you leverage a lot higher step count still and cardio alongside that, or how do you approach that?
Well, I'm super glad you asked this, my friend, because I think that many who have only heard me on podcasts have come to know me based on the many years I've been speaking about high energy flux. And I do utilize that with a lot of my clients to get lean and stay lean. And I know I introduced you and also your team to that concept. You know, you guys came to my presentation. We've done a massive series on that specific topic. Yeah. And I've really been all about that eat more, move more approach. But I think it's very important for those out there to realize, and at this point I've been coaching 16 years and have hundreds of strategies that I use in practice, probably many of which will never get covered on podcasts, as there's really not enough time to do so. But just because I've promoted a specific approach doesn't mean that I use that with every single client that I work with. I do use steps and cardio during rapid fat loss phases, but the application of these movement modalities look very different than how I would use them in a body recomp phase or in a primer phase or even in a traditional fat loss phase. And I say that because one of the biggest mistakes people make during aggressive fat loss phases is adding too much cardio in too fast. And that's really an issue because it tanks recovery, it drives up fatigue, and hinders how you feel and function on a daily basis, which then can threaten adherence. So rather than cranking up cardio like so many people do, a lot of people, when they approach a rapid fat loss phase or even a fat loss phase in and of itself, they go right hard out the gates on everything. It's like, I'm going to do 2 hours of cardio, I'm going to slash my calories in half. I don't believe in doing that. I feel that that has led to a lot of failure for many people and very poor experiences. Even if they are able to white knuckle their way through a few weeks, oftentimes they rebound at the end of that. So really, this is about putting people in a position to succeed. So when it comes to movement, I really like to take a layered approach to movement, depending on the client that I'm working with. So I'll give you a couple client like avatars that I work with and how I approach movement for them. So I have certain clients that are high output clients. They're very active, they're athletic, or they're just someone that has a very active lifestyle. Maybe it's for the profession that they have. So with my high output clients who are already active, I'll often keep cardio very minimal. And then instead, I'm going to focus on preserving training performance, fueling on training days, utilizing those 1 to 3 rapid fat loss days per week to create the deficit, and then maintaining their current NEAT levels rather than pushing them higher. And for these individuals, we don't need to increase output during rapid fat loss. We just need to strategically reduce their intake to enhance the weekly energy gap and to drive fat loss. Now, I do have other individuals that are lower output clients. So these are people with sedentary jobs or low step counts. And for those in that position, if you're spending the majority of your day seated, I really want to get those individuals up to about 8 to 10K steps per day as a baseline. And I'm going to do this as through like a lifestyle approach. So this isn't just going to be direct cardio. I often like to spread this out throughout the course of the day and almost do like movement snacks, really where we're interjecting movement throughout the course of their day. So that could be the inclusion of short post-meal walks, daily movement breaks. And then if we do need to really get those numbers up, so say that only gets them to 7,000 steps per day, then I may potentially add in some steady state, low intensity steady state cardio. Now, rather than relying heavily on formal cardio during these phases, I'm going to leverage more NEAT and really that's through the form of walking, because walking is repeatable, it's low fatigue, it's easy to do, and it doesn't impair training performance. However, if you are going to do cardio during a rapid fat loss phase, I would recommend using low intensity, steady state cardio over HIIT cardio. And the one thing I would recommend against an aggressive deficit like rapid fat loss is the use of HIIT, as we don't have the fuel availability or the recovery bandwidth for higher intensity cardio. So you want to really leave those resources for your resistance training sessions. And I say that because oftentimes when someone gets motivated for a fat loss goal, they want to throw everything at the wall to see what sticks, and they take a kitchen sink approach. So it's like, hey, I'm going to do sit training. This is very popular with women right now because of some of the influencers out there. It's like, I'm going to do sit training, and I'm going to do HIIT training, and then I'm going to have zone 2 cardio. And then in addition to that, I'm going to run an aggressive deficit. And it's like, these are all tools, and there's a right tool for the right job at the right time. And those type of sit and HIIT interval sessions would be much more advantageous when you're in a well-fueled state and you have more than enough fuel availability on board, especially in the form of carbohydrates.
Okay. So in general, very much lower intensity. It sounds like steps are the priority. And then we aren't afraid to pull that cardio lever if we need to. But again, it's going to be a lower intensity, more like a zone 2, I'm guessing, type of approach where you're taking. But it doesn't sound like it's something that we're leveraging. It sounds like we're kind of looking at the minimum effective dose there, correct?
Yes, during this phase, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Let's talk training. Since our energy intake is so low here, and building muscle is probably not going to happen for most of the phase like this, does the way we approach our training need to shift here at all?
It can, but it's going to depend on the type of RFL approach we take. So when I use the rapid fat loss days approach within a fat loss phase, training doesn't need to be adjusted much, as I have clients consuming more calories and more carbohydrates on their actual training day. However, if you're going to do a full rapid fat loss day, I do think it's advantageous to adjust training because energy availability is low, your recovery resources are limited, and it's unlikely that you're going to build muscle in that large of a deficit. So that's where we really need to shift the focus from training to gain muscle to really training to retain muscle. And the exact adjustments that I'm going to make to training will depend client to client, but one lever I usually will implement off the bat is a reduction in volume. So if I have a client, I'll give you an example. So say I have a client doing 3 to 4 sets on an exercise. I will usually reduce that down to 2 sets per exercise. And I've also found a benefit from altering the rep range. So instead of using a wider array of rep ranges, and we've discussed this actually in the specialization cycle, I really like undulating the rep ranges. So that could be anywhere between 4 and 30 reps within a program. Usually within the context of a rapid fat loss day phase, I'm going to reduce most of the work down to 5 to 12 reps, as on this low of a carbohydrate intake, high rep ranges are not only incredibly difficult to hit on a consistent basis, but they're also very fatiguing. So besides that, so we're altering the total volume, then the rep ranges that we're actually targeting, which will obviously influence the loads that are used. But I'm also going to pull back on any type of what many people call intensity techniques. I really see them as time efficiency techniques. So that includes things like drop sets or supersets or AMRAP and EMOM sets. Now, with that reduction in volume and some of these time efficiency or intensity techniques, I think it's very important to maintain relative intensity. So a client may only be doing, say, 1/3 to a half of the amount of total training volume, but all sets I want taken in close proximity to failure. So we're going very close to failure, with most sets being in the range of 0 to 1 rep in reserve, as we want to squeeze out as much of a muscle retaining stimulus from every set as possible, especially as there will be less of a total training dose per session. But these training sessions may be shorter, but they need to be very intense because this is not a maintenance routine. You still have to go in there with a mindset of progression. Now, another thing that I don't hear a lot of people discuss, but I've just found this to be advantageous in practice, is I will usually adjust the exercise selection aspect of their programming. So what I mean by that is I'm often going to shift someone away from more of, say, high skill or high technical movements, say like barbell back squats or movements like that. And I'm going to really move them into movements that are much more like machine-based or cable-based movements. Really what I'm looking for is a degree of external stability. So I want stable compound lifts, and I want them that they have minimal setup required. So there's not a lot of energy going into this. So this could be a lot of machine-based work. I do utilize like dumbbell and Smith machine variations if they have a better stimulus to fatigue ratio than the barbell versions of those. But really, when it comes down to it, I really want to kind of take off a lot of the additional and extraneous variables that could drive fatigue. So even just we look at it from a motivational aspect, certain movements you really have to hype yourself up for. Same thing can be said about HIIT cardio, like going under a set of barbell squats or a deadlift or something like that. You really have to amp yourself up. And a lot of times in these type of rapid fat loss phases, you just don't have not only the physical energy on board, but also the mental energy on board. So these are some of the adjustments that I would make. And the last thing that I will say is I really would discourage people from trying to turn their lifts into circuits just to burn more calories. You are going to have enough of a calorie burn and enough of a substantial deficit created from the diet itself. We really want to look at training for what it's best designed for, which is a stimulus for muscle growth or muscle retention, and leave the calorie burning aspect or the calorie deficit aspect to diet, and then the calorie burning aspect to your steps and cardio. Do not turn this, I get a lot of intakes, and sometimes it's like someone's trying to do everything, and in their mind they think they're doing everything right, but they're using the wrong tools and they're combining the wrong strategies together, and there's no pairing of the nutrition to the training aspect. So they're doing a lot of glycolytic work, a lot of circuit training, high rep work, metabolic type work, and then they're pairing it with a very low carbohydrate diet, and they're wondering why they're not only getting better results, but they have massive detriments in their recovery indices or their biofeedback. And so it really is about disentangling this and utilizing specific tools during this phase to drive fat loss, but also retain muscle.
Training and nutrition synergy is just such an overlooked aspect for so many people. It's very rare people are even considering how they work together. They're just thought of as two entirely separate things. We're very much like they're dependent on each other. So it sounds
100%.
like in this phase, for us to maintain muscle, one of the most important things is that we maintain our intensity within our training, right?
Mm-hmm.
We may reduce volume, we may change exercise selection to a degree, but the intensity of us pushing quite close to failure is main priority here. Is that pretty accurate?
100%. And one other caveat I will say, and this is not something that's research based, but it's from the trenches. I often like people to try to maintain their top set loads. So we're looking at intensity from two vectors: relative intensity in terms of close proximity to failure, but also absolute intensity, which means your percentage over one repetition max. And even if your reps need to come down, which is also why I shift those rep ranges, I still want someone touching those higher top end types of weights. And the reason I say that is not only is that a good way to actually assess progress first and foremost, but this is a 1 to 2 week period of time. And I find that a lot of people either go in one of two directions. They try to train with really high volume during an aggressive fat loss phase, and that just leads to poor biofeedback and recovery status, or they kind of take this as a phase of maintenance or regression. Like they're not really approaching their training from a mindset of progression. And so they're like, yeah, I can just lift light and I can lift with, a few reps in reserve. And that's just not going to be a great enough stimulus when you have such a massive energy suck or, massive deficit. You're in a catabolic situation. You need to have as much of an anabolic throughput through the muscle protein synthesizing effects or stimulating effects of resistance training. It needs to be hard and heavy.
Okay. Okay. Spot on. Do you have time to talk through supplementation?
Absolutely, man.
Cool. All right, so let's dig into some supplements, any potential supplements you enjoy or you like implementing in a phase like this that could support fat loss, appetite suppression, anything that stands out there.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first and foremost, obviously, we have covered the entire foundation. And the reason we did that is because supplements will never be the foundation. The foundation is a well structured nutritional strategy, a properly programmed training program, and then lifestyle systems that support both your execution and your adherence. But I do find, yeah, obviously, I came from a supplement background, so I do find certain things, certain compounds that can be advantageous. So, first, I'll start with some basic thermogenic agents to increase calorie burn to offset some of the reductions in energy expenditure that occur during a large deficit. So the first thing I'm going to always utilize with someone is caffeine. It's easy to access, it increases energy expenditure levels, it improves alertness, and then also one thing that it really has great research on it is it helps to reduce your perceived exertion during training. And I think that's very beneficial during a rapid fat loss phase. The next thing I'm going to pair with it is going to be green tea extract, and it's specifically going to be EGCG, which not only enhances thermogenesis and fat oxidation, so your ability to mobilize body fat, transport it, and actually burn it in the cell for energy, but also it's very synergistic with caffeine. So you combine caffeine with EGCG. Then from there, I start utilizing lipolytic agents. So really what I mean by a lipolytic agent is it's going to increase fatty acid mobilization. So the number one that I will use is yohimbine hydrochloride, especially with women. And so just for a background, yohimbine is an alpha adrenergic antagonist. So it binds to the alpha 2 receptors. And really what that means is it helps unlock stored, basically stubborn body fat. And it does this by increasing noradrenaline, which is also known as like norepinephrine, and then blocking the receptors that inhibit fat breakdown, which are the alpha 2 receptors. Now, really how I explain this oftentimes, we have 2 receptors on fat cells, and we don't have to go into like the deep fat loss physiology, but you have beta receptors, which act as like the gas, they liberate free fatty acids and let them be burned off in the cell. And then you have alpha receptors, which actually inhibit or they're their brake on the ability to essentially mobilize triglycerides, break them down, and actually liberate the free fatty acids into the cell. Well, what yohimbine acts is as an inhibitor on the inhibitor. So it binds to those alpha receptors and allows for noradrenaline and other catecholamines to actually bind to other receptors, beta receptors, and increase fatty acid mobilization. So this is very advantageous, especially in stubborn body fat areas. And the reason I say women specifically is women often have a higher density of alpha receptors, especially in the lower body. So we're talking hips, thighs, in that region, as compared to men that really store a lot of their fat predominantly in the core. And so in the stomach, the low stomach, and the low back. But this supplement can be very advantageous. But the issue with this is it needs to be taken in a non-insulin environment to be effective. So you specifically need to use it prior to fasted cardio or some type of fasted aerobic work specifically is the best case. I know you wanted to discuss this, and this is something you and I are a fan of. This is not going to be something that I would suggest for everyone, but nicotine is something that we can utilize. And for me, in my own rapid fat loss phases, I have utilized nicotine as a pulse in between meals. And nicotine has many benefits. It can increase energy expenditure, but it also can reduce appetite, and specifically, it can improve focus and cognition. So for me, I found it to be very helpful during my work blocks in between meals, as it allows me to stay focused on client check-ins, and it also helps me keep my mind off food. So this is something that it's not a first line strategy. Jeremiah, I'm sure you can speak on this as well, but it is something from an appetite suppressing perspective. And we have to consider multiple things. I work with many, very productivity driven individuals. Hunger is an impediment to their lifestyle and to their ability to really show up to their job. So this is something that sometimes we'll have conversations about, and it is something that will reduce appetite, increase focus, and then also it does have an energy expenditure boosting effect.
Does it help with fat oxidation as well?
I'm not sure if I've seen literature on that, to be honest with you. I do know, I mean, yeah, we could kind of back calculate that by increasing energy expenditure, the calorie burn aspect, that it could increase fatty acid oxidation. But with that, we also have to consider that there's multiple areas or multiple levels of the fat loss physiology process. So certain compounds will increase fatty acid or lipolysis essentially, which is fatty acid mobilization. So breaking fat out of a fat cell, turning that from a stored triglyceride into a free fatty acid where it gets cleaved off and you have three free fatty acids and one glycerol molecule. Others will help with transport. So that's like a carnitine. And then others will help with fatty acid oxidation, which is actually burning in the mitochondria of the cell. I'm not sure if I've seen literature on nicotine, so I don't want to speak without having dug into that.
Okay. I'll have to chat with you about that off air. Okay, interesting. Cool.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that definitely though a powerful appetite suppressant. I found that like oftentimes the most helpful. Again, it's a not one I bring up all that much unless I know someone
It
is more
needs to be a
prone to it.
specific use
Because
case. You have to
yeah,
know the
for
client.
sure.
You have to have a good relationship with them. That was something I actually never added that into your program, but I know that we had conversations and we both leveraged it.
Yeah, yeah. I was just ripping heaters, all that. Don't smoke it if you want your nicotine. Um, Anything else in this category you would like to mention?
Yeah, so one thing that I do find very advantageous, and this is one of the most studied fat loss stacks that is still somewhat legally available, depending on what country you're in, is going to be ephedrine and caffeine. And this is often referred to as the ECA stack. I don't think that it's necessary to add the baby aspirin in there, but I will say when we look at the literature, a lot of it is actually on the ephedrine and caffeine component. And this has been shown to increase energy expenditure. It suppresses appetite quite substantially. And a big unknown fact, one fact that a lot of people don't realize is that it actually helps to preserve lean mass during aggressive dieting. And this is through multiple components. It's going to increase metabolic rate. It helps with catecholamine production, and it actually binds to the beta receptors. So we're actually increasing lipolysis in those beta receptors. But there's very interesting research which looks at very low calorie dieting. So if I'm remembering correctly, this was like a diet that was around 400 calories. They put people in a very, very aggressive deficit. And essentially what they did was you were in one of two groups. One was an ephedrine caffeine group and one was a placebo group. So they just received placebo pills. And what they found was that not only was ephedrine very advantageous and it led to a significant effect on helping to preserve metabolic rate. Now, mind you, these people are suffering from massive metabolic adaptation. They're down at 400 something calories per day and they were obese individuals. So it actually decreased the amount of metabolic adaptation at the level of metabolic rate that they experience. But they also found that those in the ephedrine group, despite being in a massive deficit, they lost less lean body mass than the placebo group. And so it had led to a more muscle retentive effect. And that's been studied in many ways. So really what we see ephedrine really do is shift the nutrient partition or essentially the P ratio. So the amount of fat mass you lose as compared to lean mass. Now, the other thing that I find to be incredibly fascinating about ephedrine is that with many thermogenics or specifically central nervous system stimulants, there's a downregulation over time, which means you essentially build a tolerance first and foremost, and there's less of an effect, whether it be from an energy expenditure perspective or it be from an actual efficacy perspective. Now, the interesting thing about ephedrine is actually there's literature that looks at the chronic use of ephedrine, and it actually, I don't want to say it gets better over time, but we do not see that. It's almost like an asymptote. So it keeps increasing in terms of its efficacy. And then we don't really see a petering out. So we don't see like a diminishing returns response like we do with many other things. So unlike caffeine, unlike other central nervous system stimulants, there is debate on clenbuterol. There's certain mechanisms with clenbuterol where it actually gets downregulated over the time due to its interactions with the beta adrenergic receptor. And then other like lipolytic actions that it doesn't get downregulated. But really when it comes down to something that could be used or has been used in the literature longer term, meaning months at a time, not just weeks, ephedrine really takes the cake in terms of efficacy. One other thing I do actually like to utilize, and this isn't like a fat burner, but I do find it to be very useful to utilize an appetite suppressant in the form of 5-HTP, which is basically a serotonin precursor, yeah. And it influences appetite regulation, satiety, and what's really interesting about 5-HTP. First of all, if we look at like actual research on carbohydrates and their effects on neurotransmitter balance, we see why this would be the effect. But there's actually great research on utilizing 5-HTP and it decreasing carb craving. So it leads to better adherence, and not only better adherence, but better appetite suppression. So that is one thing that I found to be advantageous, especially for people that don't really like stimulants. Now, the one caveat with that, and this is something I always have in my intake process, medications that someone's taking in medication history, is we do not want to combine 5-HTP with anyone that is utilizing currently an SSRI, because there's something called serotonin shock syndrome that you can essentially suffer from if you are utilizing both together. And in that case, I've had many people, they're struggling with appetite or struggling with hunger, and then I'll utilize like viscous fiber supplementation instead. And sometimes it's not going to be fiber like a lot of people think, like psyllium husk. I actually like a product called glucomannan. that actually really has a massive viscosity and can really help with, it expands the stomach. You can put it on water, but often added that to actual meals in terms of maybe adding that to oats or to cream of rice or something to increase viscosity and have that effect of viscous fiber intake, which really helps to suppress appetite. So these are just some options. We go from the lipolytics, we go from the thermogenics, but then we get to some appetite suppressants, and then other just like things that you can utilize throughout the course of the day. I'm a big fan of utilizing like caffeine pulsing in terms of throughout the day. You can utilize that with coffee in and of itself, but even decaf coffee has been shown to decrease appetite, and then also hot liquids in and of themselves will help with slowing gastric emptying, and they promote fullness. So these are all different tools of the trade that we can leverage based on where you're at, what you're comfortable with, and then also how hard you're pushing yourself. Like these tools, I'm giving you many tools that we can utilize, and there's many more that we won't discuss. GLP-1 agonists and clenbuterol and albuterol and all these other compounds. It really needs to be discussed in a manner where it's not throwing all these at the same time. As you hear me mention, I start with caffeine and ECGC, and then I see someone's response to that, and then it's going to be based on that person's needs, their biofeedback, their response to this, how lean they're getting, their history, and also what are their comfort level, their preferences. So it's always an iterative process. There's titrations, there's changes. It's never like a one size fits all protocol, and that's why honestly, Jeremiah, we have done maybe 70 podcasts over the years together. I'm sure you can count on your hand how many times we've done podcasts like centering on supplementation. The reason, and I had a 10-year career in this, I formulated supplements that are still on the market today. I always start with food first, then we go training, then we go movement, and then the ancillary things such as the fat loss agents or the supplements or even the PEDs, they come, tertiary. They're not even secondary. We have our primary focuses, we have our secondary focuses, and then later on down the road are the things that are essentially the cherry on top.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's very important. And I think it's always like Yohimbi, and we have kind of an ongoing joke because like whenever there's a podcast about Yohimbi, I always get a ton of questions about Yohimbi. But really, like from this perspective, I would say the most common ones I implement are going to be your Yohimbi and caffeine. Mm-hmm. Should add ECGC to that stack, actually, now that I think of it. And then alongside that, maybe not that stack, but in a concert. And then alongside that, the like decaf coffee and 5-HTP. I often find quite helpful from an appetite suppressant perspective as well.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure you remember I used to use a midday fat loss pulse, and that was the combo that I used to use with you during your fat loss phase. So that's something I found to be very advantageous.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So to wrap things up, duration. How do we determine how long we want to implement this rapid fat loss approach?
Yeah, so like everything else in coaching, man, this depends. The duration of a rapid fat loss phase is really going to come down to three factors, in my opinion. It's going to be the client's readiness, which is going to be both their psychological and their physiological state, their level of leanness, and then the magnitude of the deficit that was sustained. And when it comes to client readiness, it's important to realize that this isn't for everyone. So the very first question I ask before implementing RFL is this client ready for an aggressive approach, or do they still need to restore their physiology or improve their behaviors? So if someone's coming off a long fat loss phase, if they're experiencing signs of low energy availability, say they're hormonally downregulated, or they're struggling with adherence, or they're really experiencing, say, binge restrict cycles, this is not the time to push them harder. They need to spend time increasing energy availability and restoring their physiology before we even think about losing fat. So this is why I don't run rapid fat loss phases with every client. Only those that are both metabolically and then behaviorally primed for it. Now, when it comes to duration, I always scale the length of an RFL phase based on how lean the individual is in and of themselves. So leaner individuals, so that's going to be 15% and under for men, and then 25% and under for women, I'm usually going to cap an RFL phase at 1 to 2 weeks straight. After that, I'm either transitioning them back into maintenance if we've hit their goals. So this would be in the context of, say, I'm utilizing a rapid fat loss phase during an extended building phase, and I'm just doing it essentially as a cleanup. We can hit 1 to 2 weeks of aggressive fat loss and get right back into our building, type of format. Or if we are utilizing this as a approach to induce greater fat loss, then I'm going to reintroduce them or transition them back into a moderate deficit. Now, when it comes to someone with higher body fat levels, so that will be, let's say, into the 20% for men or into 30+% for women, I'm usually going to, if I'm going to run rapid fat loss, and this is not always the approach I take, but what I do is I will often cycle through multiple cycles of RFL, but I'm not going to do them back to back. This is really going to be done based on their biofeedback and how they're handling it. So oftentimes I will utilize this approach almost in the context or in the way that I describe it as a fat loss sprint. So what I mean by that is I may start their fat loss phase in an aggressive deficit. This is someone with higher body fat percentage, so they have higher endogenous energy on board. They're probably eating a ton more calories. They're very, very motivated. And so those 1 to 2 weeks, we get a lot of wins from a scale perspective, but also from like an autonomy perspective, their competence. They're really feeling like, hey, I've been able to do this. I'm sticking to this. And then I transition them back into a moderate deficit. And then I may go like say 2-4-2-4 in terms of their actual durations of 2 weeks aggressive deficit, 4 weeks moderate deficit, 2 weeks aggressive deficit, and so on and so forth. Or there's been other cases in which I've utilized this only for short periods of time with maintenance, essentially breaks in between. So it really depends on that person, their biofeedback, how they're handling it. And then also, do they have the desire to continue doing a rapid fat loss phase? So really when it comes down to it, if I was to give a broad-based perspective, we really have to consider the fact that this is by nature an aggressive deficit. So I like to use it sparingly. So meaning a short duration and a limited frequency. The larger the deficit, the shorter the time frame that I'm going to use. And if I'm using a hybrid strategy, such as the rapid fat loss day only approach, which means I'm only utilizing that on non-training days, this is the only context in which I can extend this out. So in that case, if I'm utilizing, say, 1 to 3 rapid fat loss days within the context of, or in the course of a fat loss phase in and of itself, I will usually stair step this approach. So I'll start with 1 rapid fat loss day, and then we might run that for a week or two until I really need to accelerate their rate of loss, or they're starting to stall out due to metabolic adaptation or whatever it may be. Then I will increase to 2, and then eventually I'll get to 3, and that really extends the time course. Because when you really think about it, if you were to actually add up, and I've done this before, when you add up the amount of rapid fat loss days across the course of an actual fat loss phase, you're around that 2 to 3 week mark anyway. You've just extended it over 12 to 16 weeks. So really when it comes down to it, it's going to be based on that person's body composition, their biofeedback, their adherence, and then also their feedback to you. That's a really important consideration. We can construct on paper or in a program. We can send over the perfect program on paper. Listen, this is what's going to get you to your exact goal that you listed. But if that person isn't able to adhere to it, if they're not responding favorably to it, or there's constant lapse in adherence or communication or even their buy-in, that's not the right strategy for them. And that's where I'll tell you very frankly, there's been certain rapid fat loss phases that years prior, say 10 years ago, when I really was using this a little bit more commonly or more frequently, I didn't make the right judgment calls. A person was interested in it, and because that client came to me and asked me for it, I gave that to them. And now I'm very, very much more seasoned. I've been through many more experiences, and I'm much more specific about who I use them with, because the last thing I want to do is set someone up for failure. So I have a conversation, and I would rather have the uncomfortable conversation with that person off the bat and say, listen, I have worked with you for quite some time. We've been through different dieting phases. It's not that I don't have faith in you. It is that based on your history and based on our interactions and the data that I've collected, this is not the most advantageous approach for you. And I think that it would be a better approach for us to use a moderate deficit and really look at fat loss as a long-term goal and really stick to a more achievable and a more sustainable and feasible deficit, because this is what's going to allow you to not only get to your goal, but sustain it after. Whereas if we go the other approach, there's a high likelihood that you may only be able to get a short period of time. And this is something I've experienced with many clients in the past. And I don't want you to go through that experience, because you are capable of achieving this if we take a different method.
I think that's a very good way to kind of sum all of this up as, again, we've touched on so many times, it being for the right person, you being the right fit for this is so important. It's just not a broad-based something we would apply to everyone. I know, dude, we're coming up on time here. So
No worries.
as we wrap it up, any final thoughts you would like to leave the listeners with in terms of rapid fat loss?
Yeah, man. So overall, as we've discussed in these last 2 parts, rapid fat loss is a tool, but it's not a default strategy. And with any tool, it's only effective when it's used for the right job, with the right person, and at the right time. Just because you want to lose fat quickly doesn't mean that this is the right approach for you. In fact, if you've tried aggressive dieting in the past and it left you feeling burnt out or binge prone, or you suffered some consequences such as being hormonally downregulated, or it caused you to be on the wagon, off the wagon, meaning that you were constantly restarting every Monday because you would be on your plan Monday through Friday, and then you became a weekday and weekend dieter, essentially were off on the weekends, you veered off plan, I would really encourage you not to repeat this process over and over again. If you're interested in this approach, do not jump right into it. First, spend some time actually educating yourself about it. Start by reading Lyle's book, which I cannot recommend enough. It's the Rapid Fat Loss Handbook. That is the foundation to all of this. And then I would really encourage you to listen to the 3-part series Lyle and I have done on my podcast, Chasing Clarity, because it gives you an updated perspective. And then there's also me there bouncing ideas off of Lyle from a coaching consideration perspective. So it's really good to understand the science behind it, but then also the practical applications. And if you're, we have many listeners, Jeremiah, that tune into the podcast that we do, and there are other coaches, and I have conversations with them in the DM. So if you're a coach and you're going to use this strategy with your clients, you better have done it yourself. Rapid fat loss can be a brutal process. You can experience very high hunger from it, very low energy, fatigue, lethargia, and it doesn't feel the same as a traditional fat loss phase. And I will say this very frankly, I had already run a few rapid fat loss phases before I ever suggested it to a client, and I took someone through it. And that's really comes down to the fact that as a coach, you should never ask someone to do something that you have not done. So really, when it comes down to it, you need to understand this approach from a scientific perspective, from an applications perspective, but you also have to go through it yourself so that you understand what it's like and you can relate to your clients going through it. And this is not a one size fits all type of protocol. This is something that has to be done intentionally, strategically, and with a lot of support.
So good. Really such a great episode, dude. Really glad we got to talk about this topic. It's something I've been wanting to chat about with you for quite a while. So thank you for being here, as always, man.
Absolutely.
Again, really love this series. I learned a ton from it. I hope the listeners did as well. Before we wrap this up, we just let everybody know where they can find you and anything you would like to plug.
Absolutely, man. So the best place to find me for daily content is on Instagram, which can be found at Brandon DaCruz _. And then my podcast, which is titled the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. And then for anyone interested in individualized and like high level coaching, I'm very big into working with high achievers, someone like a Jeremiah I worked with for many years and had the pleasure of doing so. Please feel free to reach out to me via email, which is at bdacruzfitness@gmail.com, or you guys can send me a DM on Instagram. I'm very responsive. So Jeremiah, thank you so much for having me back on, man. It's always a pleasure to do these podcasts with you. And I'm glad that all these years, man, we have 6 years of just vaulted information that we've been able to provide value to other people. And I hope that we're able to continue this, my friend, because it's always a pleasure on my end.
Absolutely, dude. I already have like 5 more topics that I want to discuss with you, so that won't be a problem.
Let's get it.
But I will link up everything Brandon just mentioned in the show notes. As always, can't recommend anything Brandon does enough. Thank you for being here, dude, and we will catch you guys soon.